Hey, what's going on, everybody? Brent Hyden here, coming at you on this Monday morning, talking 6 games around the NBA. We have a lot of good games on tonight's slate, so let's go ahead and hop right into the first game of the night that we're going to talk about. Denver at Detroit. Denver 4-point favorites in this one. A 209 over under. Gary Harris has been ruled out for this game, while Jamal Murray is currently listed as questionable. I don't think he's going to play in this one. It did not sound like he was very close whenever Mike Malone talked about it the other day. Monta Morris has started the last 3 games, averaging 18.3 points and 8.3 assists per game, with Jamal Murray being sidelined, and that is where we're going to start tonight. Assuming Jamal Murray is out, Monta Morris would once again be a fantastic option across the industry. He comes in at 6K on DraftKings, 5,800 over on FanDuel. Taking a look at his game log, as you can see, over 40 fantasy points in the 3 games that he has started for Denver, has over 40 minutes in 2 of those 3 games. Draws a fantastic matchup as Detroit ranks 22nd in defensive efficiency to opposing point guards on the season. Their inability to defend the rim and inside the 3-point line will be a boost to Morris, who takes about 69% of his shots in those areas. Outside of Monta Morris, Jamal Murray would be fine if he plays. Again, not expecting him to play in this one. Would probably play limited minutes because of that ankle, but it is something to at least keep an eye on. But with Gary Harris being ruled out for this game, we can once again go back to the well with Malik Beasley. 5,500 on DraftKings, 4,900 over on FanDuel. Detroit allowing 23.7 points, 6.5 rebounds, 5.1 assists, 2.1 steals plus blocks. This would be a fantastic spot for Malik Beasley, who is just way too cheap, I think, for the minutes that he is going to likely play. Only played 29 against Minnesota, but still had a really, really strong game. Again, without Gary Harris, should play over 30 minutes. I don't expect him to be below that number here tonight, and obviously has the potential with 20 plus real points in 3 straight games to have a strong outing. I don't have a lot of interest in Will Barton, don't have a lot of interest in Paul Millsap. Millsap at least is interesting in cash at 5K on DraftKings, 5,300 over on FanDuel, but Nikola Jokic, 10-5 on DraftKings, and 11-3 over on FanDuel obviously draws a really, really good matchup here. Pistons really, really terrible defending the rim, allowing opponents to shoot 68.1% at the rim this season. That's really good for Nikola Jokic, as he takes 42% of his shots at the rim. They're also allowing opponents to really light him up in the paint in the mid-range, where he takes an additional 35% of his shots. We know he has triple-double upside. This is just a really, really, really good spot here for Nikola Jokic. If you can afford him in your lineups, again, 10-5 on DraftKings and 11-3 over on FanDuel. On the Detroit side of things, I don't have a ton of interest here. Obviously, we have been able to attack Denver in a couple of areas. Opponents have shot about 47% in the paint against them over the last 10 games. They've also shot 41.6% on corner threes and 36% on above the break threes over that span. Blake Griffin, a guy that could have some upside in the spot. He does lead the team in usage at 29.8%. On top of that, 23% of his shots come in the paint, with another 32% coming from 3. So, given that he's 8,800 on DraftKings, 9,400 on FanDuel, I do think he has some tournament upside, especially on DraftKings at that $8,800 price tag. Outside of that, Andre Drummond, always appealing if you're building 150 lineups, but it's just not a spot where I really want to attack tonight. The Reggie Jackson is probably the one option that I don't hate cramming in my lineups. He comes in really cheap, 5,200 on DraftKings, 6,800 on FanDuel. Not nearly as appealing, but that $5,200 price tag on DraftKings, really appealing. He comes in just scorching hot from the floor. Over 30 fantasy points in 4 straight games. Over his last 5 games, averaging 37.7 fantasy points per game, 43.2% shooting from 3, 48.7% shooting from the floor. Overall, 68% of his shots come in the paint or are from 3. I really like that price tag on Reggie Jackson in the spot tonight. Denver has ranked 23rd in defensive efficiency, 2-point guards over the last 10 games. That is something that most people may not catch on to. Reggie Bullock, you can use in value. You can use as a value. 16% of his shots are corner threes, with another 49% as above the break threes, but there's just going to be better places to look tonight. Moving on to Atlanta at Washington. This is one of those games that's going to be really fun to target. Washington 6-point favorites in this one, 233 over under. Troy Brown is doubtful, and Miles Plumlee remains out. Trey Young has scored 20 or more points with 8+ assists in each of his past 4 games. He's been really, really good, averaging 23.2 points and 8.8 assists on Atlanta's road trip that they just that they are currently on. Outside of that, it is worth noting they do lead the team, or they lead the NBA with 18.6 turnovers per game. That's something that we're going to talk about here in just a moment. This is the last time that we're going to see these two teams take the floor against each other. The Wizards have posted 131, 118, and 114 points against the Hawks in their first 3 games. Obviously, we want to start in the backcourt with Tomas Satoransky and Bradley Beal. Beal, obviously, the case is pretty simple. 30% usage rate since John Wall went down, averaging 46.9 fantasy points per game over that span. He is really cheap still, and he is someone that I am going to be building around. He's 9,100 on DraftKings, 9,300 on FanDuel. Obviously priced up a little bit because of the matchup, but it is deservedly so, as he is averaging 50 fantasy points per game against the Hawks in 3 games this season. Guy you can pretty much pencil in for 40+ fantasy points most nights. I absolutely love Bradley Beal in this spot. The Hawks 26th in defensive efficiency to shooting guards. As far as Tomas Satoransky goes, it is always kind of tough to trust him. He is a little bit inconsistent. He has been a little bit better lately. It's worth noting the last 2 games, minutes have not necessarily been there for him. One of those games was just a massive blowout. But I do expect him to be back over 30 minutes here tonight, and in a fantastic matchup. Atlanta 29th in defensive efficiency to opposing point guards. They are allowing 25.2 points, 6.5 rebounds, 9.2 assists, almost 40% shooting from 3, and 47.3% shooting from the floor. We've seen him average 32.8 fantasy points per game in the 3 previous games against Atlanta. I like Tomas Satoransky here. I really like Trevor Ariza, always just a strong minutes option. 5,700 on DraftKings, 6,100 on FanDuel. Atlanta allowing 36.2% on 3-point attempts. Trevor Ariza, 54% of his shots come from 3, so he does have some GPP upside. Otto Porter does draw a pretty outstanding matchup. He is just a tournament play for me. Does have a little bit of upside. He is, I believe, second on the team in steals per game, which is a boost considering how much Atlanta is turning the ball over. Thomas Bryant, always going to play limited minutes unless Jan Mahimi and Jeff Green are out, but this is a great spot here for him. Atlanta giving up 14.5 second chance points, 49.7 points in the paint per game. He comes in pretty cheap here at $5K on DraftKings, 4,700 on FanDuel. I like him in tournaments. Jeff Green, a solid value in all formats. On the Atlanta side of things, Trey Young has really struggled in this matchup, but that was earlier in the season. Again, he has kind of turned a corner recently over his last 6 games, 43.1 fantasy points per game, 23.2 points, 8.8 assists, shooting 39% from 3, 48% from the floor. Wizards have allowed opponents to shoot 36.9% from 3 this season, so that is a boost to him. And yeah, they struggle against opposing point guards. So I like Trey Young, cash, and tournaments. Usually a tournament option for me, but on this slate with the lack of really strong point guard options, he is a cash option for me as well. I really like John Collins. Made me eat my words last game whenever I said he was kind of priced at his ceiling, didn't have a ton of upside for his price, and then he comes out against Phoenix and drops 35 points with 16 rebounds. This is a matchup he has absolutely smashed in, averaging 27.6 minutes, but 40.9 fantasy points in those minutes. He's 7,600 on FanDuel. That is really, really appealing. 8,100 over on DraftKings. I love the price for him across the industry in cash and tournaments. We know that Washington getting blasted at the rim, 66.3% shooting allowed at the rim. They're giving up 47.7 rebounds, 14.4 second chance points. So there's a lot of upside here for John Collins. Torian Prince projects to be a pretty strong play, 4,700 on DraftKings, 4,900 on FanDuel. Has really struggled since returning from his injury. Is just a tournament option for me. Kevin Huerter is a pretty solid cash value, 4,400 on DraftKings, 5K on FanDuel. The return of Kent Bazemore and Torian Prince has kind of eaten into his minutes. That being said, he's still getting there most nights, and his ability to hit from three, as he's connecting on 38% of his three-point attempts this season, is a boost, as Washington is allowing opponents to shoot 36.9% from three. Of course, his minutes I have him projected at 32. Going to fluctuate in those mid to upper 20s, low 30s most nights, but again, pretty solid matchup. Has been over 20 fantasy points in those 4 straight games. And Torian Prince has been back for the majority of those games. Outside of that, you can look at Dwayne Dedmon, Alex Len. Both really, really strong options. Again, we know that Dwayne Dedmon's minutes are going to be capped right around 27, 28. He's never really going to go above that. Washington does rank 7th in fantasy points per game allowed to opposing centers. I like him more as a cash game play. I like Alex Len as a tournament play at 4,200 on DraftKings, 4,500 on FanDuel. He's basically going to get right around 18 to 20 minutes most nights, and this is a spot where he can definitely smash in those limited minutes. He has done so in this spot already this season, so I do like some Alex Len in tournaments. Moving on to Milwaukee at Brooklyn. This is a pretty good game as well. Milwaukee 7-point favorites in this one, 227.5 over under. Let's see. Bledsoe is probable. Jared Dudley is out. Alan Crabb is out. Danzan Musa out. Karis LeVert out. Dinwiddie out. DiVincenzo out. And Jason Smith is questionable for this game, although that doesn't necessarily matter too much. Russell has scored at least 20 points in 13 of 16 games since missing the team's visit to Milwaukee earlier this season. Ed Davis has been a rebounding machine recently, averaging 12.2 rebounds and 21.6 minutes over his last 5 games. If you're a betting person, might be worth noting that the Nets have won 9 in a row at home. Milwaukee favored by 7 in this one. Might be something to take a look at. But from the DFS side of things, let's look at Giannis Antetokounmpo, who comes in at 10-9 on DraftKings, 11-6 over on FanDuel. Really strong option here, despite what people might think. Of course, has been limited in a few of his recent games because of blowouts and things like that. But guy has basically a 50 fantasy point floor. And this matchup is really good for him. Generally like taking Giannis in matchups against teams that protect the rim, or that don't protect the rim very well. And if you look, Brooklyn on the season, 62.3% field goal percentage allowed at the rim. That being said, over the last 10 games, opponents are shooting 67.3% at the rim against Brooklyn. This is a very underrated spot here for Giannis. I have a lot of interest in him if I can pay up for him tonight. If I want to get some exposure here and I want to pay down, it's going to be Malcolm Brogdon, as always. Benefits with Brooklyn struggling to defend the rim, takes 54% of his shots. There has top 24 fantasy points in 8 of the last 10 games. Really, really consistent cash option. Really, really good tournament option. Always comes in at low ownership and is just too cheap for the upside that he has at his position. I really like Chris Middleton as well. This is a pretty good spot for him in the spot. Brooklyn has allowed opposing small forwards to shoot 40.4% from three, 46% from the floor, 42% of his shots come from three, another 34% in the paint and mid-range, where Brooklyn is allowing 44.2% shooting and 42.5% shooting. Chris Middleton coming in at 6,400 on DraftKings, 6,800 on FanDuel. Really, really good tournament option here. Has been over 30 fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 games. Has some upside. Really, really good spot here for him. Had a big game against Brooklyn the last time these teams faced off, dropping 29 points with 7 assists and 4 rebounds. Eric Bledsoe is always just tournaments for me. And then Brook Lopez I think is a really, really interesting value option on DraftKings at 5,400. He's 6,400 on FanDuel, a little less appealing over there, but he's been really good recently. He's connecting on 44.8% of his three-point attempts, 60% of his overall field goal attempts, averaging 29.3 fantasy points per game over his last 5. Has flashed a ton of upside recently. Has had some monster block games with 3, 3, 5, 6, another 3. This is a spot against the Brooklyn Nets. It is a revenge game. 34 fantasy points against them last time out. I like Brook Lopez, especially in tournaments here tonight. On the Brooklyn side of things, obviously D'Angelo Russell has been outstanding since Spencer Dinwiddie went down, averaging 23 points on 19.2 field goal attempts, 45% field goal percentage, 6 assists, 1.4 steals, 2.8 rebounds. While the Bucks have been better about defending in the paint in the mid-range recently, they're still a team that I do like to target with shooters, with guys that take shots in those areas, and he does take 43% of his shots in those areas. They're allowing 34.2% of their opponent's shots in those areas. So Russell's going to be able to work into the paint and into the mid-range and take a lot of shots here. I like him in cash in tournaments, 7,900 on DraftKings, 8,500 over on FanDuel. Shabazz Napier has been a really steady option for the Nets since Dinwiddie went down. He has topped 30 fantasy points in 3 of the 5 games since Dinwiddie went down with his injury. Napier, more of a cash option, coming in at 5,400 on DraftKings, 5,800 over on FanDuel. Russell would be the tournament option here. Joe Harris is questionable here, but I do have interest in him, assuming he's able to give it a go. The Bucks rank 8th in fantasy points per game allowed to opposing shooting guards. Their issues defending the 3-point line, pretty big boost here for Joe Harris, who takes 49% of his shots from beyond the arc. I have a lot of interest in him as just a cash option at 4,700 on DraftKings and 5K over on FanDuel. Just a guy outside of a couple of games recently, going to get you in the mid-20s, low 30s most nights. And this is a spot where he did have some success at putting up 22 fantasy points in 21 minutes last time these teams faced off. I do have a lot of interest in DeMarre Carroll. If I'm dealing with anyone from that muddled front court, it's going to be DeMarre Carroll. Milwaukee allowing opponents to shoot 41.2% on corner threes. He takes 16% of his shots from the corners. Opposing small forwards are shooting 38% overall from 3 against the Bucks. DeMarre Carroll coming in at 4,500 on DraftKings, 4,800 on FanDuel. Has been pretty stable recently. Top 20 fantasy points in 7 of his last 10 games. So this is a pretty good spot here for him tonight. Had a really good game against Milwaukee. Again, the last time these teams faced off. It is worth noting that D'Angelo Russell was out for that game, however. I'm not really interested in Rodions Korix, Jared Allen, guys you can sprinkle into 150 lineups if you wish. Ed Davis would be the guy that I would look at for value at 4,100 over on DraftKings, 5,200 on FanDuel because of the rebounding that he has produced recently. It's just not a very good matchup. Same goes for Rondae Hollis-Jefferson. Minutes just a little bit too inconsistent for me to really have a ton of interest in him here tonight. Moving on to the next game, Indiana at New Orleans Pelicans. New Orleans 1-point favorites in this one at 218 over under. Anthony Davis, Nikola Mirotic, Etuan Moore, Elfrid Payton, Julius Randle, Victor Oladipo, and Doug McDermott all out for this game. Corey Joseph is questionable. Jrue Holiday was held to 15 points in Saturday's loss at the Spurs, but scored 20 or more points in 7 of the previous 8 games. Domantas Sabonis has really struggled, 2 of 16 from the floor over his last 2 games. Looking at the Indiana side of things, Bojan Bogdanovic, he's been crushing it with Victor Oladipo out. He has a 25.7% usage rate with Victor Oladipo off the floor. That is an increase of 4.7% over his season average. Averages an increase of 4.01 fantasy points per 36 minutes. Draws in a superb matchup. Pelicans 28th in defensive efficiency, 2 small forwards. They're giving up 22.3 points, 8.1 rebounds, 4.2 assists. Bojan Bogdanovic, 5,700 across the industry. Gonna be a guy that I'm going to be forcing into my lineups. We saw the upside last game against Miami. This is a fantastic spot for him here tonight. I have a ton of interest in Bogdanovic. He's just a guy, most nights I feel really, really confident in what he's going to give me in cash games, and he obviously showed he has tournament winning upside. So at that current price tag of 5,700, he is my favorite way to get some cheaper exposure to this game. I do love Darren Collison here as well. His assist percentage goes from 28% to 35.8% whenever you take Victor Oladipo off the floor. Averages right around a fantasy point per minute. We've seen the stability come out of him recently with 30 plus fantasy points in back-to-back games. The production's going to be there for him. Had 30 plus against Toronto, against Memphis. Again, the production's going to be there for him. This is a really, really good spot for him as well. New Orleans really bad against opposing point guards. They're 27th in defensive efficiency to opposing point guards on the season. We did see Corey Joseph the last couple of games enter the starting lineup. That pretty much takes all value out of Aaron Holiday and Edmund Sumner. It does make Miles Turner a really, really strong option, especially now that Tyreek Evans is heading over to the second unit. Miles Turner with Victor Oladipo off the floor, 1.15 fantasy points per minute, 22.1% usage rate. And with the Pelicans really struggling on the glass, they're allowing opponents to pull down 49 rebounds per game over the last 10 games, and they're really struggling to defend the rim, where Turner takes 31% of his shots. I have a lot of interest in Miles Turner, so if I was ranking these guys, it would be Bojan Bogdanovic first, Darren Collison second, Miles Turner third, because there's a lot of really, really good center options on the slate. But 6,300 for Miles Turner, really, really appealing. We've seen upside out of him. We know he's going to get a couple extra shot attempts and has some rebounding upside in the spot. You can look at Domantas Sabonis, especially at his price tag, in tournaments. Again, has really struggled to shoot recently, but we know he has a ton of upside. He's shown it several times this season. Just really hasn't come over the last 10 games. He has really struggled. But again, in tournaments, building 150 lineups, he makes a decent amount of sense. So does Thaddeus Young. He's more of a cash game option, but he's someone that I don't hate getting some exposure to. We know the minutes are going to be there for him. We know the production's going to be there for him. But he's kind of like fourth on my list here tonight. On the New Orleans side of things, obviously, Jrue Holiday coming off a down game against the Spurs. Still a guy most nights going to get you 40 plus fantasy points, going to take a ton of shots, very high usage rate with all these guys out the floor, 27.2%, 1.38 fantasy points per minute. Jrue Holiday, a very, very, very strong option. Indiana has struggled to defend the three-point line over the last 10 games, and they've struggled to defend the rim. They're allowing opponents to shoot 64.7% at the rim over the last 10 games, 36% on above the break threes. That accounts for about 62% of Jrue Holiday's field goal attempts. So this is a pretty good spot here for him. Darius Miller makes it for a pretty strong tournament or cash tournament value, 4,800 across the industry. We know the minutes are going to be there for him with all these guys out. In Indiana, they have struggled to defend corner threes, allowing 40.6% on corner threes. 12% of his shots come from the corners. In these games where teams have just struggled to defend corner threes, like Oklahoma City, it's a spot where Miller has had success. So did struggle against San Antonio, but the minutes are there for him. The field goal attempts are there for him. If he can just get you a couple of those assists and things like that, that's really going to help. But it averages 0.81 fantasy points per minute with all these guys off the floor. Kenrich Williams has been a darling for people of late. 4,300 on DraftKings, 4,900 on FanDuel. Pacers 10th most fantasy points per game allowed to opposing power forwards on the season. He's still a really strong value, still going to play a decent amount of minutes, has started eating into those Solomon Hill minutes, and he has paid off in 3 straight games. This is a really, really good spot for Kenrich Williams, a pretty strong value here tonight. Jahlil Okafor, terrible matchup, but 24.6% usage rate, 1.15 fantasy points per minute. Those numbers are pretty tough to ignore. Unfortunately, 7,100 on DraftKings, 7,500 on FanDuel. Pretty much off my radar at this point, outside of cash games. Looking at the rest of these guys, Tim Frazier has played at least 20 minutes in 3 straight games, has topped 25 fantasy points in each, has been just collecting assists like crazy. At least eight in 3 straight games. He does average 1.02 fantasy points per minute whenever you take all these guys off the floor. Really low usage rate though, 14%. He's kind of like Darren Collison, does just have the ability to notch a bunch of assists and get you a couple of points. He's fine as a value. He's 3,900 on DraftKings, 4,400 on FanDuel. Frank Jackson is a pretty solid value here as well. Takes a decent amount of his shots from three, and as I mentioned with Jrue Holiday, the Pacers have struggled to defend the 3-point line. I like him in tournaments. I do think he is cash viable as well. We've seen the upside out of him. Did play 42 minutes against the Spurs. If he gets hot like he did against San Antonio, he's going to get the minutes. 3,700 on DraftKings, 3,900 on FanDuel. He makes for a very, very good drop to score option on FanDuel. Moving on to Houston at Phoenix, one of the last games of the night. Houston, 8-point favorites in this one, 229.5 over under. The only injuries to note, TJ Warren and DeAnthony Melton remain out. Harden has reached 30 points for 26 straight games. The Suns are centering an average of 122.3 points per game over the last 10 games. Yeah, it's going to be a high-scoring affair. Kenneth Faried averaging 16.4 points and 9.6 rebounds in 7 games since joining the Rockets. This is a good spot for the Rockets. Obviously, it starts with James Harden. Don't let any morons out there tell you that James Harden doesn't have upside because Chris Paul is back. He has topped 70 fantasy points in 2 games since Chris Paul returned. He averages 1.70 fantasy points per minute with a 40.7% usage rate in 111 minutes with Chris Paul on the floor. Again, if people are telling you that James Harden does not have upside because Chris Paul is back, well, they're a bunch of idiots, and you shouldn't be listening to them because they're idiots. Anyways, great matchup for Harden. Play him if you want to play him. Lock him into your lineups if you want to lock him into your lineups. More of a cash game option, but it's James Harden. So, yeah. Prior to sitting out last game, the aforementioned Chris Paul had top 30 fantasy points in 3 straight games, had done so without playing 30 minutes in any of them. Does draw a dream matchup. Suns 25th in defensive efficiency, 2 opposing point guards. He's 6,600 on DraftKings, 7,300 on FanDuel. I kind of think Chris Paul could be a pretty sneaky tournament option here tonight. Outside of those two guys, Kenneth Faried, lock city. I don't hit the lock button on a lot of players. I don't call players locks too often, but Kenneth Faried, yeah, he's basically lock city. 7K on DraftKings, 8K over on FanDuel. Suns giving up a league-high 62.2 fantasy points per game to opposing centers, giving up 46.4 rebounds, 15.3 second chance points, 52.3 points in the paint. Kenneth Faried has topped 30 fantasy points in 6 of his 7 games with Houston. Projects to play a boatload of minutes here in a good matchup. I love me some Kenneth Faried. The rest of the Rockets, though, a little bit problematic. You can still look at PJ Tucker in cash games. Phoenix allowing opponents to shoot 42.2% on corner threes. Over 50% of PJ Tucker's shots come from the corners. He's 4,400 on DraftKings, 4,700 on FanDuel. Gonna have a lot of up and down games, but in a matchup like this, could definitely be one of those up games for him. I think Eric Gordon is a strong tournament option. He's 5K on DraftKings, 4,900 on FanDuel. The price is just getting down to where it's really tough to not consider him. Is coming off a down game against Utah. Obviously, it's Utah. But the field goal attempts are still going to be there for him. He's still going to notch a couple of rebounds, a couple of assists, and maybe get you 15, 20 real points. And if he does at that current price tag, you're pretty happy with that. So I don't hate taking a shot on him. Outside of that, you're not really looking at Gerald Green. You're not looking at James Ennis. You're not looking at the rest of these guys. They're just garbage. James Ennis, I guess, on FanDuel. But like the dude's playing like 30 minutes and getting just like nothing in fantasy production. So not really my cup of tea tonight. On the Phoenix side of things, obviously, if we're getting a bunch of exposure to Houston, we probably want to get some Phoenix exposure, and that starts with Devin Booker, 34.8% usage rate, 1.32 fantasy points per minute with Warren and Melton off the floor, 9K on DraftKings, 9K over on FanDuel. Price tag, a little bit tough to stomach, but we know he has upside, over 57 fantasy points in back-to-back games. This is a good spot here for him tonight. Kelly Oubre, I think, is my second favorite option from this game, or from the Suns side of this game, and he's the guy that I'm going to be forcing into my lineups if I'm not getting Devin Booker or someone else that I'm going to talk about here in just a second. 26.4% usage rate, 1.08 fantasy points per minute with Warren and Melton off the floor. He's coming off the bench. That actually helps him here. He's been outstanding for the Suns since Warren went down. 14.6 points, 5.4 rebounds, 2.2 assists over that span. High energy player. Houston allowing 68% shooting at the rim. Kelly Oubre takes 41% of his shots at the rim. He has a lot of potential to have a good game here. He's just 5,800 over on DraftKings. He's 6,600 over on FanDuel. Most nights going to get you mid to upper 20s, but does have 30 to 40 fantasy point upside. And he's just been really, really consistent, and that's really, really good to target over in cash games. Josh Jackson, pretty strong option here, although he has struggled from the floor recently. He had struggled to shoot. He had struggled shooting from the floor before the last game on Saturday. Went 10 of 15 from the floor on Saturday after going 17 of 53 in the previous 4 games. Houston 20th in defensive efficiency to opposing power forwards. I don't hate getting some Josh Jackson at 5,700. He's another guy most nights going to get you in the mid to upper 20s with some upside. I did have a couple of down games here, but that was before the Warren injury and things like that has really stepped up with Warren being out. So I do like Josh Jackson a significant amount as well. Two cheaper ways to get exposure here. DeAndre Ayton, 6,800 over on DraftKings, 7,400 on FanDuel. He's another guy I might be mashing that lock button on. Houston has allowed 50.4 rebounds per game to opponents over the last 10 games. He showed no signs of rust going up against Atlanta. Did shoot really poorly, 5 of 15 from the floor. Still had 11 rebounds, 3 assists, a block, a steal, 13 points, 35 fantasy points. He has a ton of upside in the spot. I do really, really like DeAndre Ayton. Mikal Bridges has been on fire recently as well, averaging 28.1 fantasy points per game on 13 points, 1.8 assists, 5.4 rebounds, 54.2% three-point shooting, and 61.5% shooting over the last 4 games. 24% of his shots coming as corner threes. Could have some success here. Houston has a lot of opponents to connect on 40% of their corner 3 attempts over the last 10 games. He's 4,400 on DraftKings, 5,700 on FanDuel. Minutes floor really, really high for Bridges, as he is a really good defender, and that makes him a really, really strong cash option here tonight. Moving on, last game of the night, San Antonio at Sacramento. This game, a 227.5 over under. San Antonio 2-point favorites. Derek White is out for this game. Dante Cunningham is listed as probable. Definitely slate changing news that we need to pay attention to on that one. LaMarcus Aldridge averaging 26.4 points, 12.4 boards over the last 5 games. DeRozan 8 of 26 from the floor in 2 games since returning from a knee injury. And Bogdan Bogdanovic, 6 of 33 from 3-point range over the last 5 games. Minutes are going to open up in the backcourt for the Spurs, which means Marco Bellinelli, Patty Mills will likely slide into the majority of those minutes. I currently have Bellinelli at 27 minutes. Patty Mills at 29 minutes. Both of these guys, excellent value options here. Bellinelli was already on my radar. Kings 27th in defensive efficiency to shooting guards. They've allowed them to shoot 38% from 3. Bellinelli has topped 20 fantasy points in 8 of his last 10 games. He's just 3,900 on DraftKings, 4,500 on FanDuel. Really, really good cash game option, but does have some tournament upside in the spot as well. I do like Marco Bellinelli a significant amount here. I do like Patty Mills. I like Bryn Forbes. All 3 of those guys, really, really strong options. I think Patty Mills is going to be the tournament guy, though, the guy that you want to use in large field tournaments, the guy that I think is going to be overlooked from that trio. DeMar DeRozan, 33.1% usage rate, 1.22 fantasy points per minute when you take Derek White off the floor. Kings ranked 25th in defensive efficiency to opposing small forwards over the last 10 games. So if DeMar DeRozan was ever going to snap out of his funk, it would be tonight. He's 7,500 on DraftKings, 7,800 over on FanDuel. I love the spot here for DeMar DeRozan. As I've mentioned in the past, rebounding upside through the roof here for DeRozan. He's second on the team in rebound chances per game at 11, and with the Kings giving up 48.2 rebounds per game. This is a pretty high upside for DeMar DeRozan, so he is someone that I'm definitely going to be trying to force into my lineups here tonight. I do think LaMarcus Aldridge is fine in all formats. Again, averaging 46.7 fantasy points per game on 24.2 points and 11.2 rebounds over his last 6. Kings 23rd in defensive efficiency to opposing centers on the season. He leads the team in rebounding chances this season. And Rudy Gay, third on the team in rebounding chances at 10.8. Again, I'm harping on rebounding chances because the Kings are a really bad rebounding team. So this is a pretty good spot here for Rudy Gay as well, and it is a revenge game. He comes in at 5,900 on DraftKings, 6,200 over on FanDuel. Kings giving up 23.4 points, 10.4 rebounds, 46% shooting to opposing power forwards. The Kings side of this game, and you can look at Davis Bertans as just a value option as well. Not someone that I have a ton of interest in, but at 3,800 over on FanDuel, kind of intriguing as a dropped score option. But over on the Kings side of things, not really as interested in this side, even though, like, if I'm getting 3 Spurs, which I'm probably going to be doing in my lineups, I want to find someone from the Kings side, and I'll get to that in just a second. But De'Aaron Fox looked really good in his last game, 19 points, 8 dimes against the Sixers, draws a great matchup. Spurs 24th in defensive efficiency to opposing point guards. They're giving up 24.5 points, 6 rebounds, 9 assists per game to the position. De'Aaron Fox at 7,300 on DraftKings, 7,600 on FanDuel. A pretty strong tournament option here. Lack of consistency makes him more of a GPP play. Does take 81% of his shots at the rim, in the paint, or the mid-range. I do like his chances to score, to put up a pretty good game here, so might end up being cash game viable just because there's not a whole lot to like at the upper end at point guard tonight. The Spurs have allowed opposing shooting guards to connect on 37% of their three-point attempts this season. That is a pretty big boost to Buddy G. Buckets, who takes 46% of his shots from 3. He is a pretty strong cash and tournament option here tonight. 6,700 on DraftKings, 6,600 on FanDuel. Consistency has been there for him recently, even in some of these games where he's playing limited minutes because of blowouts. Getting you 30 plus fantasy points most nights. Did have a couple down games against Toronto and Brooklyn, but still most nights gonna get you low 30s with a lot of upside, as we saw last game. I do really like Buddy Hield. You can look at Bogdanovic as a little bit of a cheaper option, more of a cash game play. Outside of that, Marvin Bagley is going to be a fade for me here tonight. Spurs just really, really good against opposing power forwards. It is worth noting Bagley has been playing really, really well. So in 150 lineups, I don't hate maybe taking a shot on him in tournaments. And the last guy I'm going to talk about here, Willie Cauley-Stein. Price tag way too cheap. He's 5,800 on DraftKings, 6,100 over on FanDuel. I absolutely love him on DraftKings. A really strong option over on FanDuel, but more of a DraftKings play because of position eligibility. Has topped 30 fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 games. Spurs 23rd in defensive efficiency to opposing centers over the last 10 games. So if you're fading Ayton or anything like that, he could be the nuts option here tonight. But that's going to do it for this slate. I will be back, I believe, tomorrow. I'll have to look at the schedule. I think tomorrow is a larger slate for a Tuesday, but good luck in all your contests tonight.